Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome to day 63, the chronological read through the Bible. Today's commentary is picking up at Numbers chapter 16 through 18. And at this point, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram have stood against Moses. Korah, being the ringleader, has called out Moses and basically challenged the authority and leadership of Moses and Aaron. And you just have to wonder at this point, what's in their mind? What are these people thinking? That's so much of the time when the people begin to complain, when they start to say, well, this just isn't the food that we had in Egypt, or you've brought us out here to die. Do they not remember all the things that had just taken place? Do they not remember how Moses and Aaron faced Pharaoh themselves, risked their very lives for the freedom of all of the people there in the wilderness? And then this is a thing that people throughout the world, and especially here in America at times, it's almost like they would rather be a slave and have security and have all of these benefits in exchange for their freedom. And, I was raised with the principle of I would rather be a free man in a dangerous society than a slave in one that's safe. But these people are saying, hey, we wanted to go back to Egypt, but you brought us out here to die. But at least you have your freedom. Your freedom. A greater freedom that awaits for us eventually is our freedom in Christ. We're set free from all of these penalties of the law. We're set free from not having to present all of these offerings. And I know that seems a little off but from today's commentary, but it still just comes back to me that how could they not see all that the Lord had blessed them with? And now they're challenging Aaron's leadership when Aaron had two sons that were consumed by fire because they didn't worship the Lord and approach the Lord in the right way. It said that they offered strange fire before the Lord. And now these men would say, who are you to be the leader? Well, if God was displeased with Aaron, he wouldn't have allowed him to continue to minister. If God had been displeased with Moses, he wouldn't have chosen him to lead the people. Yet there are some people who are never satisfied with leadership. Anytime there's a problem, it's always the leader's fault, and they don't consider all the difficulties that leaders go through. And oftentimes I come back to this where Paul speaks of all of the difficulties that he had faced. A night and a day in the sea, and beaten and stoned and going hungry and going naked even. And he says, but above all these things, it's his concern for the church. And I realize that right now, for the most part, the only people who are going to really hear what I've just said and be like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, are my fellow ministers. They're the other pastors that are listening to this or watching this, because you know what it's like to walk out of church and have that pain in your heart of the young person or the person in your church that you know is in a great spiritual struggle at that moment. And you know that just a little decision in one direction or another on their part will determine a big part of where they end up. And you've given the godly counsel and advice that you could, but oftentimes people don't listen to it. It can become very painful at times, and that's what you end up going home with, and you're praying over it. That was the leader that the people had in Moses. Moses was pleading before God for the people. And so was Aaron. Many if they had suffered the great loss that Aaron had, they would have just walked away from it, wouldn't they? They would have said, well, I can't please this God. He just took my two sons. But Aaron knew different. And Moses knew different. And even when God says, stand back, I'm going to wipe out all these people, Moses pleads with the Lord, no, Lord, don't do this. Korah, Dathan, and Abidan will end up being swallowed up. God says if these men are in the wrong, that an unusual way will take them, and the ground will open up and swallow them. And I remember as a child seeing a cartoon, and I wished I had that today. Maybe sometime I can search for it on the internet. I don't know that I would even use it in my ministry, because it was one of these things that stuck with me, but was kind of really weird and gruesome, because the ground opened up, but it was a mouth with teeth. And whether that's what it really looked like or not, I don't know. But as a child, that made a great impression on me when Moses speaks of the ground opening up, and it opens up like a mouth and eats the people. But wow. Could you imagine not being willing to follow Moses and Aaron as your leaders, as your spiritual leaders? Can you imagine standing up against Moses? Can you picture people even saying, I'd rather be back in Egypt? It breaks your heart. But people do it all the time in the church. They're in church for a little while, and then it's sort of like, well, things were a little bit better over here. I kind of like the way it was over here. Now I'm not going back to the bar all the time. I'm not even going to drink tonight when I go to the bar. I'm just going to go and hang out with some of my friends. And, well, I might sip a little bit, but I'm not going to get drunk like I used to. Right? And then they're right back to where they were. Keith Green. He was an early contemporary singer from the 90s and 70s, 90s. And if you go back one of his songs, and I would put it here, but it'll kind of get me, it'll get our video, I guess, blacklisted maybe. But search for So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. And I'll try to put a link to that video down in the box below. But it really draws that out of where these people, they think, well, it's going to be better in Egypt. And it's so heartbreaking. At the end, I think that, again, this was one of these pictures that stayed with me for many years, is when the rods of the leaders of each of the tribes are gathered and they're placed before the ark. And the next morning, Aaron's rod not only has flowers or leaves on it and flowers on it, but it even has ripe almonds on it. Something that would be more than unusual. And to designate it that Aaron is going to be the priest for the nation. And where some would think, well, that's a sought after position. Again, it's sometimes funny how the world looks at certain positions. And when you're in that position, you think it's not very sought after. Your phone may ring at any moment, and it's a person that's in need. And again, as I mentioned, you may have seen that person that morning leaving, and you're like, oh, if they just would. Or you watch this person make bad decisions, and yet now they're calling you, and you know that they're reaching out in desperation, and you want to help them. And you may have had a long day, but great joy comes from helping those, from finding that lost sheep and bringing them back. But as a minister, you know that that's not a job that you would say, I want to be a preacher and I want all of this. You take it on because it's what the Lord's put before you, and it's the broken heart that you have. I wish that people could understand the weight that pastors bear. I often tell people, if I hear somebody complaining about their pastor, I say, you don't understand what he might have been facing. I said, this very day, he may have rejoiced with the couple who just had their first child. And he may have also been mourning with a couple who had just lost a child. He may be counseling with a husband and wife couple that are near divorce. He may be dealing with another issue which he can't even speak of. Maybe someone's child has been kidnapped or has been molested, and you're upset that the pastor didn't greet the visitor who you brought to church this morning. You see, be patient with your pastor and realize that there's likely a lot of things going on behind the scenes that you have no knowledge of. And when I've pointed this out to people before, I said, I want you to consider maybe a time that you desperately needed your pastor or this particular pastor. And I said, would you have wanted him to explain to someone who was saying, well, Pastor, I don't understand why you couldn't just fix the toilet that was leaking or replace the paper towels in the bathroom? Would you have wanted the pastor to say, well, I couldn't do that because I was counseling this person through whatever their difficulty was at the moment? I know that this is maybe a bit of a stretch, but I want you to understand that your church leaders need your support in prayers, in word of encouragement, financially even. Take some time this day and pray for the leaders in your church and what other leaders, pastors, missionaries might come to your mind and heart. And don't just do it today, but pray for them whenever they come to your mind and heart. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope that your day's gone well. Until tomorrow, God bless.